Tom and I do a few things together, and you guys, was it all, or 95% of you are entrepreneurship majors? All? Okay. So, so what Tom asked me to do is do the history of entrepreneurship and innovation for Cincinnati, USA, and I just told you a little bit about myself, and you might, during the course of this, learn a little bit more about your home area for the bulk of it. So again, raise your hand if you aren't from Cincinnati, and you are 50 miles from here, inside that. So you,
Columbus.
so everybody's relatively local. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are Ohio stuff, is whether, in addition to these things. So how many of you have been to Union Terminal? Virtually everybody. So what was Union Terminal? In 1973, I made a presentation with a guy named Theodore Berry. The city had just gotten Union Terminal from the Southern Railroad for $1. Sounds like a great deal, right? It was a huge white elephant. So the Union Terminal was built in 1933. It was the largest, not largest, but the most modern train station built, and it did a tremendous business for 20 years, particularly during World War II. So you see the old movies, train stations were a pretty big deal. They wanted to make them pretty. And so one of the things that they did is they wanted to have some murals. They hired some German artists, and they wanted to represent the industries that were big in the area in 1933. So you'll still go in Union Terminal, and there's still a lot of the murals, but most of the murals have gone out to the airport, particularly for that depict some of the more important current industries. So you've all seen those out at the airport? And what's the problem that they have out at the airport now? People that sold our souls to Delta Airlines, now we got to close terminals, and where are the murals going to go now? Convention Center, okay, at least some of them. So these are some of the things that are still down at the Museum Center that hosts the Children's Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the History Museum, okay? So, how many of you have, Columbus, Chillicothe isn't that far, who have seen the Alan Eckert outdoor play on Ohio? So essentially, Tecumseh, Blue Jacket, Daniel Boone, you ought to take your kids there when you have kids. So why is this innovation? Ohio was obviously not one of the 13 originally colonies, but it was populated pretty quickly. So how did the settlers, and they weren't really, the British didn't want them to go west of the Appalachians, why? Make the Indians really mad, right? Because they had already taken the whole eastern seaboard. They weren't too wild about that and said, hey, we got these mountains, you guys got everything else. So what area did they go in first, and where did Daniel Boone go through to actually get into Ohio? What's the area that they populated first? And it happened to be the hunting ground for all the Indian tribes, northeast, south, and west. So nobody really lived there. They all hunted there. Kentucky, right? The Cumberland Gap. Who's been to Asheville, Virginia, North Carolina? All right in there, there's a gap. There's only 2 points in the US of A where you actually have a break in the mountains. One is the Erie Canal. I used to live in New York, and the Mohawk River Valley, and the Cumberland Gap. So there was a huge movement of population from the east coast to Kentucky. Then you guys have all heard of, hopefully, Boonesboro, Little Turtle, all the battles that they had down there, Daniel Boone. I don't think they teach us in history anymore in high schools. Anyhow, this is what happened. And when they came across, then they kind of took over Kentucky. Kentucky was the 15th state. New Hampshire was the 14th state. Vermont was. So then they're going to go, so what's wrong with Kentucky? Fort Thomas, what's wrong with Kentucky?
A lot of hills.
A lot of hills and a lot of what? Rocks. So in particular the cane fields in Lexington, those were great areas, but a lot of the mountainous region wasn't really all that good. So if you went across the river, and this is where all the Shawnees, the Miamis, the Iroquois, the Hurons, they lived in Ohio. Because it was terrific farming, and it was good for them just as it was good for us. So that brought scads of people. And in the 1790s, Cincinnati, well, first of all, was started in 1788. And what was the first building ever built here? One of my speakers does the investment for Western and Southern Life Insurance Company. And guess what they call that organization? Fort Washington Capitol, like Fort Washington Way. So what was the first building ever built in this part of the state? And it only follows Marietta was the first place, a little closer to back by Pittsburgh, which would have been relative civilization in those days. So what would have been the first building that was built? Fort Washington Capitol. Clue. Fort Washington, which was a what? Fort. Why did they build a fort? They didn't want to get scalped. You know, it was really simple. So, so these settlers come to the extent by 1850, after some of the other things you're going to see from 1788, nobody. 1850, Cincinnati is the 5th largest city in the country. Okay? So what did the frontiersmen bring with them? Other than rifles and stuff like that. Pardon?
Snakes for trading, right?
Well, they would have killed some of those animals and traded for them, but now they're coming to actually farm and to settle and to that kind of stuff. So what animal did they, well, first of all, everybody knows where Kings Island was, right?
Right.
So if you go from the Ohio River to Kings Island, where it started to be a little bit different topography, what could a squirrel do?
Jump from
Tree to tree and never touch the ground. It was primeval forest. And particularly around here with all these hills, it was just jungle. Then when you got up to Kings Island, you could actually farm. So if you were a farmer, would you rather cut down a bunch of trees or just start planting? And the soil gets, you know, Columbus is really good farmland, the whole middle part of Ohio is terrific. So what animal did they bring with them with the settlers on the flatboats? You guys have all seen the flatboats and stuff, right? So they brought horses, right? Okay. And they probably brought some cows, right? Chickens. But what was the most important animal they brought with them? What's the name of the marathon that's run every year?
pigs.
So what was an old nickname of Cincinnati? Porkopolis. Okay. So what they would do, how many have lived in like Anderson Township or up on the western side of Till? So what do you think? They bring these pigs and they just let them loose like cattle in the Wild West. So what do you think these pigs ate?
In Anderson?
Mm-hmm. What's the road going up the hill called?
Up the hill?
Up the hill from Lunkin Airport to Anderson Township. From Columbia Parkway.
Sound?
No, Beachmont Avenue. Right? You know what Beachmont
Yeah,
Avenue
I
is.
know.
So why do they call it Beachmont Avenue?
Beech trees.
They have beech trees. What do beech trees have? Nuts. So they just let these pigs forage around, and then at the end of the thing, just like, I know you guys don't watch the old movie, Clint Eastwood, you know who that is. The first thing he ever did was in a movie or a TV show called Rawhide, where they, you know, they do the cattle. You watch Me TV, our friend over there. So anyhow, they do the same things with the pigs. Okay, we'll get back to that story. For the ladies, we got one lady in this group, right? So you got all these clunky frontiersmen running around, but where are the women? There was as many women as there were with men. Ever hear of this woman? Her name's up there, right at the bottom. What's her name? Mary Ingalls. Ever hear of the Mary Ingalls Highway in Kentucky? You from Ohio or Kentucky? Ohio, so you're off the hook. Who's Mary Ingalls?
I've heard of it, but I don't know her.
Okay. Your name again is?
Megan,
Megan. So you're 21?
22.
22. She's 17. She's got 2 kids. Anybody know where the New River area is, where you go whitewater rafting over in West Virginia? That was Virginia. That West Virginia didn't happen until the Civil War. They weren't supposed to be over on the western side of the Alleghenies, right? Because they had a treaty with the Indians, the British. This is 1755. But if you don't have any land, you're an indentured service, you would risk everything, okay? So she's got a homestead, her family, she's at 17, 18 years old, she's got 3 kids, okay? Great life, right?
Yeah.
She gets kidnapped along with several people in her little village. They take her 3 children and her, and you know where they take her? To the Kentucky side. They take her to Covington, okay? Covington is great because they got the Licking River. That was really important transportation mode back there. And do you know what they did with their 2 boys that were 1 and 2? They gave them the chief because they needed braves to take place of their sons that are already got killed by white men, right? And she just she becomes essentially a slave, okay? Not a great life. She had a hard life before. So she escapes on the Kentucky side of the river, and she goes back to West Virginia, 250 miles away, with 23 rivers to cross, all the things feeding into the Ohio River, and guess what? She can't swim. And she's with a nutty Dutch woman that's with her that's going progressively more bonkers. So she gets back to West Virginia, takes her about 4 months. She loses all her teeth. She has totally white hair. And guess what? She has 5 more children and lives to be 85 years old. So that's a pretty neat story. If you want to be a tough woman, you'd be Mary Ingalls, right? Yes, sir.
You say 5 more?
5 more. She lost 3 of them to the chiefs. So she had to start all over. And her husband was one of the few guys when they had, maybe there were 10 braves that sneak attack, they wipe out, 10, 12 people, take slaves, take off, bat out hell before, the rest of them can get after. So that's a little bit of history of this area. And the ilk, when you think of when people went from Portugal to Brazil or wherever, or they went from Holland, or they went from Germany, or went to England or Scotland to America, why did they do that? Because things were pretty crappy back home. They didn't really have a choice. If they had a choice, a lot of them just stayed back where they were, but some of these people, and these are the type of entrepreneurs that became the heart of Cincinnati in the area. Dan Hurley is one of my speakers. I would doubt any of you have seen this television show because it's on 6 o'clock Sunday morning, although you could all DVD it. He's the predominant history. If you think, oh gee, this guy knows a lot about Ohio history, this guy knows 100 times more than I did. So he's written a book called, or he had the 25th anniversary of the area. And he says Ohio is, in Cincinnati, is all innovation, and it's all got to do with the river. If the river wasn't here, Cincinnati wouldn't be here. So they floated down on these flatboats, okay? And they had a pig and some settlers and blah, 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 and they got to Cincinnati. And they found the area between the Little Miami and the Miami River, so basically between Anderson Township and Harrison, to be great. They found, because of the Licking River, Cincinnati was the best place. Anybody for bonus points? You give them bonus points? What was the original name of Cincinnati? God, they gotta teach you this stuff in grade school, don't they, in 4th grade? Yeah.
Was it like La Santabelle?
And you know what that stands for in Latin?
No.
The area across the river from the place between two rivers, essentially. So, which was really a good name. But the first governor of Ohio was a military commander named Arthur Sinclair. And he was at the last meeting with Washington when he said, and Washington could have been president. He wasn't really president for several years later. He didn't want to be president. He could have been king. He could have been empire. He could have been dictator. And he says, I'm going back home to Mount Vernon and be a gentleman farmer. And he also had the biggest whiskey still in North America at the time. So he appoints one of his, and they called that the Cincinnati Society. So you probably heard about that. Who was Cincinnatus? Big down at Sour Point, there's a great big statue of him. My 5-year-old grandson likes to poke his toenails.
Like a Greek something, Greek god.
Roman,
Roman.
okay? And what did he do?
Didn't he take over like temporarily for I guess.
He was a gentleman farmer.
Yeah, and then like he could have like stayed like indefinitely, but he decided to just go back to his farm.
So what did he do with his sword?
I don't know.
Turned it into a plowshare, or the blade on a plow. So this Arthur Sinclair, and who appointed Arthur Sinclair to be the governor of Ohio territory? The president, who was George Washington. So he's trying to suck up too, you know. So all these things, where these things are coming, and then you're seeing something more in the 1840s, 1950s. So where was the steam engine in the steamboat actually? Who was the guy, and what was the river that it started on?
I guess Ohio River.
No. What was settled way before Ohio? So this is the boondocks. Fulton, you ever hear of Fulton? Fulton Steamboat, and it was the Hudson River, so 15 years later. And then you got this tremendous expansion of the West. Cincinnati was the West, the Queen City of the West. So we'll get back to this and we'll show you how some of the murals, but I wanted to give you this. And also all these books I am showing you happen to be, and I have a couple books for you, Tom, at the end, can all be purchased at the gift shop at the Union Terminal, the Museum Center, okay? So these are just some books. You might even, it sounded like some of you had to come up with books to, I assigned book report too to my students. I thought they looked at me like I had a tendril on my shoulder.